So we will run through some things. I know it's a bit awkward when you're by yourself, you're imagining people there. That's the nature of Zoom sometimes, but we want to just cover off some of the procedural things. I do want to say from the outset, however, in the lead up, I did put a link to the ITF tournament rules, albeit without some of the most recent updates. I want to stress that the ITF tournament rules are for the ITF World Championships, okay? So this class today is pitched at domestic events. And that's not to say there are not similarities. Obviously, because we're doing ITF and we should base what we do on that kind of model. However, those rules are written for the top level competitors, black belt and above, usually the best in your country. And it's very, they're written with that in mind. So, however, when we run a tournament, our objectives in running a tournament, whether it's an intra-club tournament, whether it's a local tournament, whether it's a state championships, whether it's a national championships, are not necessarily the same objectives as the world championships. Because there are many different reasons to run a tournament, not always to see who's the best, okay? You might run a tournament as a promotional activity for your martial art, for your club. It might be run as a means of getting students and officials some experience in familiarity with how the events run, give them a bit of confidence, and so on, before you sort of just throw them into the national championships. Or we've seen clubs in the past send people to the world championships that have only competed in 1 or 2 tournaments previously, which is obviously not the most ideal preparation. So there are all different levels of tournaments that we run. So having said that, sometimes our competitions involve, yellow belts and white belts and green belts, obviously who don't have the same experience and don't, if we were to follow the ITF rules to the letter, it wouldn't be the most practical thing to do in that situation. And I'll give you one example where we actually tried to do that a couple of decades ago now. We decided we're going to make our national championships the exact same rules as the world championships for every category in the tournament. And we had about 30 yellow belts enter patterns. And of course, the rules say that you do a designated pattern, an optional pattern. And a lot of these people only knew 1 pattern. Some of them knew 2. So by the time they got to the final, they performed Chonji pattern and maybe Dangun about 7 times. I mean, how many times do you need to see the same pattern? So obviously that's not practical for beginners. So quite often at a domestic tournament, we would modify the rules, whereas we may not run the patterns, for example, and we're going to talk specifically about patterns in a moment, according to the pyramid system, which is what happens at the World Championships. So what we often try to do is, for the black belt categories, we would still try to run them pyramid systems similar to the ITF format, so that when they go to that next level, they're familiar with the format. But for the beginners, it's really not practical. The same would apply if we talk about sparring. And, we have designated length bouts, 2 rounds, 2 minutes, and so on and so forth, which is fine for an adult, which is probably fine for adolescents, which is probably fine for a lot of people, but it's not always necessarily great for your 6 and 7 year olds. That could be the longest 4 minutes of their life, and also makes potentially unsafe because if they're not fit enough to last that distance, well, that's the time when there's a greater risk of injury. So our number 1 priority in running any event is not only to determine who the medal winners are, which sometimes people get a little bit too focused with that. Our number 1 priority is to preserve the safety and well-being of all the people who take part, and also to showcase what it is we're presenting to the public, because it's a public event. So we've got to get that balance between, yes, it's a competition, yes, there's rules, yes, the rules have to be consistent and fair to everybody, but at the same time, it has to be visually appealing to the people who are watching. because if people don't find it interesting to watch, they stop coming. If parents stop coming, competitors stop coming, and you don't have a tournament. And again, different when we talk about the World Championships, because everybody wants to go, every country wants to be represented. But sometimes at a local level, domestic level, it's constantly a battle to encourage people to attend. And in fact, what we often found in the past, it's often counterproductive to run our domestic events strictly by the ITF rules, because the people who are not aspiring to compete at that level simply stop coming. Okay, we often find that the contact mirrors World Championships contact, which is completely inappropriate for local level, club level, even to some point national level for colour belts and children in particular. So there's a whole lot of reasons that we allow that, discretion of the national organisation or discretion of the tournament host to design the event to meet the objectives of the event. Now, having said that, at a intra-club level, you pretty much can do what you want. At a local level, again, to a large degree. Once we get to a state level, we want it to be reasonably consistent. So if we're asking people to travel from state to state, they don't want to be going to the next place having absolutely no idea how it's going to run. So any tournament that you do run, anything that you do put together, and I guess this is pitched at prospective hosts, is you need to tell people at the point of registration or prior to signing up and paying for this event, how the event is going to run. It's unfair on competitors not to know how the events are running. It makes it very difficult to prepare, and also does open it up to things being changed on the day, which is not always a good look. All right, anyway, so this is just general information. So I think we've got most people in the room now, so I'll get Justin just to stand here beside me so I'm not hogging the screen. He's better looking than me anyway. So the main focus of this morning, I haven't got a clock in front of me. I know that we've set aside 2 hours, but I'm going to go until I've run out of things to say. Don't be scared. But the main focus of today will predominantly be sparring and patterns. And the reason is because where there's the most variation we find from tournament to tournament, and again, I'm not talking about the World Championships, which has to be strictly by the letter of the rules. Where there is most variation tends to be in the breaking events, because quite often to encourage juniors and to encourage colour belts to participate, we can't have them doing 5 compulsory breaks. So we might vary the event to make it more not only spectator friendly but participant friendly as well, where they may only have to do 1 break, or we may modify the type of break that they do, again, to make it more fun, okay, because if it's fun they'll enter, and if it's fun to do, it's probably fun to watch. So that's where I'll have Ashley jump in towards the end, just to explain that aspect, the non-sparring and patterns aspect, and how that's going to run specifically for that event later on this year in August, and also to encourage you all, where possible, to come along. All right, so having said that, I want to start with sparring. Quite often the umpiring training that you're doing, again, this is not about preparing you to umpire at the World Championships. It's a whole different course, okay, very specific to those rules. And it's not a matter of just walking in and saying, well, I'll volunteer to umpire. Quite often when we run a tournament, we ask people to umpire because we need a certain number of officials to assist. And people graciously offer, some more graciously than others, but they're not always necessarily equipped to do the best job. So the objective with any competition where you've got one person versus another person, or one team versus another team, the simple objective from an official's point of view should be that the person who deserves to win wins. That means the person who performed better at that particular moment should win. And that's, the rules are supposed to assist that. And it's not about, whether someone's from my club or your club, or whether this person, we've seen them 100 times and we know that they have a higher skill level than the other person. It's purely about that performance at that particular moment. Whoever performs best should win. Now, having said that, when you've got 4 judges or 5 judges or whatever the case might be, everybody should see it relatively consistently. Now that's quite often where we have sometimes some issues where some people are more familiar with the rules than others. So obviously the ideal official, the ideal judge, the ideal umpire should be someone who's very knowledgeable in the rules, very knowledgeable in the techniques, so that they know exactly what they're looking at and they know exactly how to score and what to score. And that is not as easy as you think. That's not a matter of just turning up to training and getting a black belt, because that's a specific skill set in itself. But of course, you know, if you have reached that level of proficiency, sometimes we assume that you do know the stuff fairly well. But however, you may look at it differently. It's always easier to do it than it is to judge it. And they say if you want to learn something really, really well, try and teach it. Okay, and that's sort of similar to try and judge a performance, because we're breaking down someone's performance into details that quite often when we do it, or sometimes when people teach it, they don't teach it to that level of detail. So we're going to cover off on some of that today, just to give you a better idea of what it is I'm looking at, how it is I'm expected to score it consistently, to make it fair for everybody that takes part. All right, so away we go. We're going to focus on, first of all, the characteristics of an umpire, what makes a good umpire. I already mentioned it, you need to know the rules. You need to know the rules, you need to know the technique for that event. So if we say the most, often people think the most difficult thing to umpire is sparring. In fact, I find sparring the easiest thing to umpire. Okay, whether I'm a corner judge, a little bit harder physically as a center referee, but the center referee doesn't actually score the match. The center referee generally doesn't influence the outcome of the match. Okay, not too much anyway. The only time the center referee can have some influence is whether they're being a little bit inconsistent in how they award warnings or fouls. Otherwise, the result is almost totally dictated by the corner judges, okay, because they're the ones scoring the match. So sometimes you go to a tournament and you think the center referee is like the glamour position and the corner judges are the people who kind of begrudgingly get dragged into work. But in fact, the corner judges are the most important people for the outcome of that match. So don't put your least experienced people in the corner thinking it's a less important position, because the corner position is the one that dictates the result. So you need to have people in the corners that absolutely know what they're doing. And sometimes people, by seniority or ego or whatever the case might be, if you ask them to go in a corner, they almost feel offended or insulted because they're not the jury president or they're not the center referee. You want your best people in the corners, okay? Of course you want a center referee who can control the match, okay? But you need to have your best people in the corners, okay? The people who are not overly familiar with the rules, they're the people who are going to be the timekeepers. They're the people who are going to do the jobs which don't directly outcome the result of the match, okay? And that's the biggest mistake most people who run tournaments do, is they drag people from anywhere and they put them in the corners, okay? I can't stress that enough, because that's where you're going to have problems with results, okay? Particularly when the people judging are often, judging with limited experience. Like I said, sparring is the easiest thing to judge because there's only so many ways you can score, okay? Patterns, there's no hiding away from the fact in patterns. You cannot judge patterns if you don't know the pattern intimately. I don't mean you just don't know how the pattern looks. I mean you need to know the technical aspects of the pattern inside and out to judge it efficiently, to judge it fairly, okay? Because there's so many things that we're looking at when someone performs a pattern, and two patterns which may look pretty similar may not score all that similar at all. Okay, so first and foremost, I can't stress enough, know the event that you're running. I can't umpire a football match not knowing the rules of football. I don't have to have played football, okay, but patterns is different. Patterns is very difficult to judge patterns having never performed patterns. You don't have to be elite in your performance, but you have to be elite in your knowledge. Okay, that's important, all right? Second thing with an official, and this goes without saying, but I'll say it anyway, you have to be fair, you have to be consistent, you have to be non-biased. Okay, when you're an umpire, you are no longer from your club. Okay, there is red team, blue team, umpire team. It's 3 different teams. Okay, sometimes when we go to a tournament, I have people say to me, you know, when I'm judging my own students, I'm a little bit tougher on my own students. That's incorrect. You shouldn't be tougher on your own students, but you shouldn't be easier on your own students. You should be consistent with everybody regardless of where they're from. Okay, and I know a lot of people in their head, they believe that they are, but sometimes when you see in practice, it's clear that they're not. Okay, so you really need to be really disciplined with yourself and avoid any other pressures of other people or spectators or families, or worry about if this kid loses, is their family going to drag them out of my club? All of that stuff is unimportant. The most important thing is the person who deserves to win wins. Okay, so it needs you to be impartial, needs you to be consistent, needs you to be fair to both competitors or both teams. That's super important. All right, and I know sometimes it's difficult when you're judging your own students, or sometimes it's difficult when you're umpiring or centre refereeing your own students, but really it shouldn't be. Okay, I mean, I don't find it difficult, but in the early days, I did feel a little bit more pressure. Now I don't, because for me, I'm not on either team. Even if it's students from my own school, when I'm an umpire, I don't feel like I'm from their school. Okay, so that's important, that you need to have this impartiality. You need to be fair. You can't be biased, even subconsciously. You need to be completely free of any attachment to your students or your club. All right, and that's important. That's why, even though we're in Dobok this morning, just to keep it relatively formal and to make us more photogenic, when you're in a tournament, we don't really like people umpiring in Dobok. Okay, now I know sometimes when you're competing and then you jump in the ring to help out because maybe they're short of people, it's not always practical to run back and forth getting changed, you know, into your umpire uniform or whatever the case might be. But you have to understand perception. And you may be a great umpire and be able to do the job just as well, regardless of the clothes that you're wearing. But if you're umpiring with your club tracksuit, with your club logo emblazoned on it, or even the same badges and symbols as one of the competitors and not the other competitor, and when a match is in dispute and it goes the way of the club, which is the same club as yours, doesn't mean you've done an incorrect job. But the perception from people, sometimes that's the first thing they point at is, well, look, obviously they're from the same club, which is not always fair, but perception can be the difference between them coming back and not coming back. So very important. If we're going to be neutral, we have to look neutral. So it may be a case of, even if you're in Dobok and you need to throw a jacket over the top, have a jacket that's not your club tracksuit, okay? Not when you're going to officiate, because again, it's not a great look. Doesn't matter if it's a club tournament and you're the only club there, then not a problem. But when you're inviting other schools, it can be. And again, I know a lot of it's perception. All right, so just something we do want to say. We actually have an umpire uniform. The correct umpire uniform, again, if we're talking about, you know, a formal championship, say ITF World Championships, for example, navy pants or skirt, white shirt, navy tie, navy jacket, okay? Sometimes even at international competition, they will wear a polo top, and we've run comps where we have a polo top because it's a little bit easier to move, especially if you're doing it for 3 or 4 days in a row, but also allows the opportunity for any commercial partners that you have, any sponsors that you have, to get some sponsorship value. They might provide the shirts and they have a logo on the shirt for the umpires. You know, that's a commercial reality of having an event that's viable to run. So you do have that scope, but if you're going to do that, then of course all your umpires have to be wearing the same thing. Sometimes you go to a tournament and you look at the tournament and there's someone in shorts and thongs and t-shirt, tank top, singlet, and they're sitting in a corner judging an event. If you're not dressed appropriately, you don't officiate, okay? You don't come in street clothes, and it's really upsetting to us when we see instructors, sometimes 4th, 5th, 6th degree instructors, come to a tournament in their street clothes. It's one of the more disrespectful things you can do if you intend to work. When you're preaching etiquette and all those things to your students and you don't demonstrate that yourself. You have to dress accordingly, okay? And that's very important. If you know you're going to compete, bring spare clothing that you can officiate in, all right? In an ideal situation, of course, we have an abundance of officials and we can separate officials from competitors. Like I said, in the World Championships, you would never in a million years compete and officiate, all right? But sometimes in domestic tournaments, you know, we need officials, and sometimes, again, a lot of the senior ranks all decide they want to compete, but you have to appreciate that at some point in time, you know, people have to run the tournament. I could have competed in 100 more tournaments if I wasn't running them, okay? But I had to make a decision at a pretty young age that my focus was going to be running events, not competing in every event. Okay, I don't need a million medals, I just need the important ones, okay? So again, sometimes, you know, some instructors can't detach themselves from whether I'm a competitor or whether I'm an event organizer or an official. And again, sometimes you've got to appreciate that the most important thing, if you decide to put on an event, the most important thing is not you competing, the most important thing is you running the event. So if it means sacrificing some of the lower level events, like local events, club events and so on, so that you can purely focus on running the event, and you can target the national championships and the world championships and those sort of things for yourself, okay? But again, you know, quite often where we struggle for competitors is because everybody puts their own participation ahead of the purpose of the event. So we're presenting this as the national organisation. So we're telling you from a national organisation what our hopes and expectations are from our most senior people. And I know, looking in the room, I'm preaching to the converted in some cases because some of you only officiate, but again, sometimes you get to that point where, you know, I'll help out a little bit as long as I can compete, which is fine unless you're competing in 6 different events, which means it's you know, you're sort of jumping in and out for 5 minutes here and there, okay? Officials need to be available the whole day, okay? And the more people we have available the whole day, the less likely it is that we need you to work the whole day, okay? But when it's left to too few, those too few have to do a lot, okay? And that makes it really tough. And again, you know, if that person decides next time I'm not going to come because I had to work from dusk till dawn, you're not going to have the championships. All right, so a good work ethic, okay? You need to prepare to give to the event. That's important. Thorough knowledge of the rules, impartiality, good work ethic, good presentation, okay, and the ability to follow instructions, to work as part of a team. Okay, that's important. Because I know on the dojang floor we have rank, and you know, and we do a lot of things according to rank, the way we line up and things like that. But you know, when it comes to running a tournament, sometimes you have to put rank aside and just understand your job description and the job that you need to do, okay? Quite often you go to a tournament and the most senior people, again, are put in positions where they have the least influence over the bout. The most senior people and the most knowledgeable people, and we assume quite often they're the same people, have to be in a position where they have the greatest influence on the event. Because otherwise, what's the point of having all that knowledge and experience when you're sitting in a position where you don't actually have an input? All right, so again, it's sometimes we do it in a reverse way. You know, we sort of buffer the most senior people because we don't want them to work. As a senior person, you should want to work, okay? That's important. All right, so let's start with sparring then, because again, we don't want you just sitting there watching a screen all day. We could have just sent you a video. Sparring obviously is generally divided into two. Some tournaments, depending on the competitors that you have, may not run team sparring, but every competition runs individual sparring. So individual sparring, whether it's at beginners or if you like peewees, you can call it anything you want. level, which is like sort of primary school children, early primary school children, you know, we have to be mindful of contact. The number one question we get in every, you know, course that we run and sometimes the events that we run is how much contact is going to be allowed. And so we still have these people who have this fixed mindset that, well, if you compete in the World Championships, you got to expect lots and lots of contact. So therefore, every tournament we run, there has to be lots of contact. Well, you're going to have a tournament with lots of contact with no competitors, okay? Because when a parent sends a 6 or 7 year old child to a tournament, they don't want to see their child get bashed, okay? So you need to get out of that mentality that every event needs to mirror the World Championships. Completely stupid mindset, okay? You're not actually understanding the objective of the tournament is to teach people and to give them a positive experience. Yes, there's going to be a winner. Yes, there's going to be a loser. The lesson is winning well, losing well, okay, doing your best, but not potentially risking serious injury, potentially dropping out of the sport at a very young age when you might have had, you know, a long future ahead of you and lots of potential, purely on this experience in 1 2-minute round or 1 2-minute match. All right, so we need to scale the contact according to the level and the age of the participant. Okay, and if you're observing what's happening globally in sports across the board, okay, they're trying to eliminate as much unnecessary head contact as possible because of this link to brain trauma. And yet here we are allowing young kids to punch each other in the head. You know, so it really doesn't mirror what's happening in the rest of society. So we need to consider things. 1, level of contact. 2, the points scoring, okay, for very, very young kids, whether we allow head contact at all. Number 3, the protective equipment, and whether we insist that young children in particular, or even others, should wear headgear. And again, the 2 separate schools of thought on headgear, whether headgear is assisting with the contact or whether headgear makes the contact worse. But there is issues that when a person hits the floor, quite often the greater issue is the head hitting the floor rather than the fist hitting the head. So, you know, so we need to do everything we can. We're standing here today on soft mats, actually double layered mats. You know, I think back to when I used to compete, there was no mats, nobody had them. It was on hard floors. If you're still competing on hard floors in 2021, then you're probably a little bit too frugal. Okay, you should invest in a set of mats if you intend to run a tournament. I know many people train on a hard floor and that's fine, but you got to understand that the harder the floor, the greater the risk of injury. Why mats were invented was to help protect from some of those injuries as well as being more palatable on the eye. So all things you need to consider. How much contact? Needs to be a safe level, okay? I'm not going to say exactly, you know, it does depend on, if tiny kids, I would say almost none at all right? It does become difficult to judge, I know. I'm not a great fan of non-contact for the higher level competitors and the more advanced competitors because it can be a little bit subjective, like was it within 1 centimetre, 3 centimetres and so on. So it needs to be a clear contact. But I guess what we're talking about is contact versus uncontrolled contact. Contact where the person executing the technique has full control over the range and the target point of the technique rather than just punching through a technique. That's where you get your problems. Okay, so that's where you need to consider what type of techniques you're allowed. Where the person is swinging uncontrollably and the contact is incidental, that's the type of contact that often that causes injuries. All right, so the most important thing is being very strict on the techniques that are allowed as well. All right, so scale the contact, start from practically none for little kids. If you don't like that, don't allow them to compete. You start your competition from an older age group upwards. If you're going to allow contact, then allow contact only for the older and more advanced people. All right, it's very difficult and very off-putting, like I said, when people go to a tournament, and also if it's not their categories, even when they see other categories, people getting injured, people getting hurt, and so on. And long term down the track, you know, you could open yourself up to some problems where you deliberately allowed that to happen without all the safety measures in place. All right, so contact is probably the number one thing when it comes to sparring. I'm not talking about the rules at the moment. This is purely about how you conduct your event and the culture or the environment that you're creating. As an umpire, okay, the person who has the most control over the contact is not the center referee, it's the jury president. Okay, of course the center referee is there on the spot when there's an incident, they stop it, okay, but the jury president is the one who's in control of that ring and should lay down, okay, this is what we're going to allow in this category, in this age group, and so on. And then the center referee only has to execute according to those guidelines. When it's left at the discretion of the center referee, that's when you get a lot of inconsistencies. Because if you've got a center referee who's always umpiring at the World Championships, they tend to be too liberal with the contact for the categories that are not appropriate. If you've got a center referee who's very anti-contact, sometimes they pull up too many things for the advanced categories. So you need to have a jury president that says, okay, this is very clear what we're allowing for this category. And it has to be for the entire category, not match by match according to who's competing. So sometimes we have a category where I might compete in one match and I might get through to the next round, and the two matches are completely different in terms of how much contact is allowed. And often it can be the same umpire. You have to umpire the entire category the exact same way. Okay, you can't umpire and say, okay, this match I'm going to allow contact, but in this match I'm not going to allow contact when it's the same category. It has to be. All right. What makes it difficult often for an umpire, of course, is where the categories are mismatched. Okay, and that is the responsibility of the tournament organizer when you do the brackets, when you do the pairings for your matches. And I know it's difficult when you have low numbers of competitors, but you have to match people according to, you know, certain demographics. So you need to consider their age, you need to consider their rank, you need to consider their size. Okay, very important. And of course gender in some events. Okay, in the World Championships, of course, every event is separated by gender. Sometimes in club events or local events, we may mix males and females, particularly in patterns or breaking or special. And in very rare situations would be in sparring. Sparring, perhaps at a prepubescent level, I wouldn't advise it for you know, adolescent and adult and above. Okay, and that's not you know, that's not a reflection on either gender. It's to make it as fair as possible for the competitors. All right, but where you've got a mismatch, sometimes a common thing an umpire will do is to protect the person who is seen as being disadvantaged. They will be stricter towards the other person. And again, it's a difficult situation. It's very hard to expect one competitor to sacrifice their own performance because the other person is disadvantaged. What we can't take into account is different levels in skill. Okay, and again, that's one area sometimes where people get upset. You know, you have a black belt enters a competition against someone who's been to 3 or 4 international competitions, and they say, oh, but this is my first tournament, it's unfair, you know, can they take it easy? Well, it's kind of not really fair on either party. I know some clubs focus on tournament more than others, but you know, we can't really have a bracket where we say, you know, if we had 500 competitors, we could have an entry system, and I've seen it at other competitions where they say, well, if you've been in 3 tournaments or less, you know, indicate that on your entry form. If you competed internationally, indicate that on your entry form, and we try to create 2 different categories. That's fine if you've got hundreds and hundreds of people competing. It's not always practical when you've got 40 or 50 or 100 competing. But anyway, things to consider. So umpiring is not simply a case of just applying the rules. When it comes to the overall event, we need to consider safety and well-being of the competitors. But that's what I'm saying, is everybody's part of a team. From the tournament organizer to the jury president to the umpire to the corner judge, you're all part of the same team. So we're all responsible for that environment. Okay, All right, so with sparring then, I mentioned contact. Contact again, scaled according to age, scaled according to experience level. So what I mean by experience levels is your belt ranking system. So at adult black belt level, we wouldn't expect the same contact as for 5-year-old yellow belts. Okay, but having said that, at adult black belt level, that's where we would closely mirror, you know, the official ITF rules, and the official ITF rules do not say it's full contact anywhere in the rules. Okay, so again, don't just assume because it's black belts that anything goes. Adult black belts still have rules that are expected to be followed, and some of those rules pertain to contact. And the contact is all about the level of control that the person executing the technique has over the technique, okay? Where the technique is designed to reach the target and make contact, not to penetrate through the target. Now, I know that those of you who've participated internationally or umpired internationally know that it doesn't always look like that's the case. But again, that comes back to the umpiring, and it comes back to the jury president allowing it, and the person running the tournament who's established that culture, which is not necessarily consistent with what's written in the rules. Okay, so we need to be consistent. All right, the other thing, match duration. Okay, match duration is how long the bout goes for, and in the World Championships, 2 rounds by 2 minutes. I mentioned earlier on for Pee-wees, sometimes we've had 2 rounds by 1 minute, okay, or 2 rounds by 1.5 minutes. What I like to do is have the rest period. So 2 rounds by 2 minutes, the break period would be 1 minute. The break period is usually half the length of the round. If you're going to have a break for 10 seconds and start again, well, it's not much point having a break at all. What we have done where we've had larger numbers of competitors sometimes is have the elimination matches as 1 round, and then when we get to the finals, we make the finals 2 rounds, because again, the objective is that people get an experience, people have a chance to compete with the outcome when we get to the results end of the category, that the best 2 people often should make the final, or at least, you know, there is the off chance sometimes with the bracketing that they might compete against each other. Unless someone didn't check the time zones. All right. So there are occasions sometimes where we have like elimination and then get through to the finals, where we have the full length match in the finals, where you've got the best competitors competing. All right, but again, that's the prerogative of the person running the event. But you need to tell everybody
Recording
before.
in progress.
I just started recording.
Yeah, sorry, we're just working through some technical things. You need to have a coaches meeting at the start of your day and say, this is how we're going to run in terms of that regard. We're not changing the rules. The rules are as stated when we entered, okay, but due to the numbers of competitors or due to whatever factors, we're going to do elimination through. But if you can include that in your pre-event rules, that's even better, of course. All right, match duration. When we get to the other side of the spectrum, so people in my age category, which might feel that 4 minutes is a long time as well. Obviously, it depends on your level of fitness as well. But sometimes we might shorten it for the older competitors, if I can say that diplomatically enough. And again, because it's not that we are trying to lessen the quality, it's that we're trying to actually maintain the quality. And it's easier to maintain quality for a shorter period of time than it is, you know, quite often you see, let's say if we're talking about 40 plus, 50 plus, and I know some people are fitter than others, but you see a very dramatic decrease in performance the longer the match goes. Yes, hypothetically, you should train harder and be fitter, okay, but at the same time, come back to the objective of the competition. Are we trying to get as many people participating as possible to enjoy the experience, or are we only focusing on the elite? If we're only focusing on the elite, we go 2 rounds, 2 minutes, and we expect them to be super fit. Okay, but if we're wanting mass participation, then we have to encourage mass participation. And yes, when we're training, train harder and get fitter and all of those things as well, but to encourage people to participate. Because when people are fatigued, that's when there's a higher risk of injury, particularly when one person is fatigued and the other one isn't. Okay, then that becomes a potentially dangerous situation, especially when you're allowing more contact than you should. All right, so these are things you need to consider, because we do have a duty of care to the participants as well. You know, and that's important. And part of our duty of care is creating that environment that's safe. So bout duration, level of contact, they're probably the consistency and fairness of our matchups. They're the three components that really dictate the culture in the ring and the safety level in the ring of the competitors. The other thing I'll say while we're on that topic is you need to have first aid. You need to have first aid that can cope with an environment where there is some incidental, or in some cases some deliberate contact. Sometimes we have first aid come along to an event and they say, well, we didn't expect that people were going to get hit in the head. Well, you know, you're coming to a martial arts tournament. You need to be very clear when you book first aid that you tell them the nature of the event that they're coming to, so that they can send the right people and so that they can bring the right equipment. Okay, don't try to sugarcoat it and say no, it's very safe and very non-contact, so that they'll agree to come, and then when they come, it's quite different altogether. All right, so that's an important thing as well, because if there is an injury, if there is someone that does get hurt and there's not the appropriate person or the appropriate response to deal with that, then again it puts you in a very vulnerable position. But more importantly, it's no good for the person who needs the assistance. Okay, so it puts them in a very unsafe position as well. All right, again, things to consider. So now let's get to the rules then of sparring. So like I said, many of you, in the room have a fair bit of umpiring experience, so you'll know this already. But we're going to recap for the benefit of those who may be officiating for the first time or haven't had a lot of officiating experience. When it comes to sparring, there's, I guess, two categories we need to consider. One is what are the scoring areas of my body? What parts of my body are targets? And then we need to consider what the point scoring criteria is for the various targets. So if I was to use Justin as a model, so we take the body from the hips down. Okay, so anything from the hips down is not a target area. So there's no scoring area or no target area from the hips down, which means that you're not supposed to do any technique which is directed at or makes contact with anything below the hips. Okay? Sorry, just allow these latecomers. Maybe they went for a coffee or something and came back.
Master Cliff.
Okay. Adelaide time zone. All right. Anything below the hips, not a scoring area. If I take the body from the side, anything from the middle part of the body back is not a scoring area. Okay? So from the hips and below and from the center of the body back, all those areas are not scoring areas, which means that our only scoring areas are from above the hips, front half of the body. So my torso, including the sides but not the back, my head, the front, the sides but not the back. That's important because quite often you'll see people get kicked in the back of the head and the judges will score the points. That's incorrect. Back of the head, back of the body, below the hips, none of those areas are scoring areas. Okay? The arms are not scoring areas. Okay? So otherwise, every time you block a technique, the other person would score a point. So the arms are not scoring areas. It's the torso, front half, the head, front half. Okay? Important that you understand. If you see a technique that does not reach or hit those areas, it is not a point. It doesn't matter if the person spun, it doesn't matter what happened that caused it to hit the back, it's not a point. Okay, very important to understand, because sometimes we say, judges say, well, it would hit them in the front, but they turned around and hit them in the back, so it should, well, absolutely not. If it doesn't make contact with the front half of the body above the hips, it's not a point ever, 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 okay? It's like playing football and kicking the ball through the points and saying, yeah, but it was going to go through the goal, but the wind blew it, okay? It's either a point or it's not a point. If it's not front half of the body, if it's not above the hips, it's not a point, okay? And even sometimes when it is the front half of the body and it is the front half of the face, it may not be a point, but we're going to explain that in a minute, okay? Because it's not just about where the technique goes, it's also about how the technique got there, okay?
We have a question.
Very good question. What's the question?
Yeah, good morning, sir. How are you?
Yeah. Are we doing questions already?
In regards to the contact, if there is a technique going and the opponent deliberately is continually turning their body so that it is a non-scoring.
Sure.
Is there what happens in that respect there? Is there?
Oh, we're going to get to the rules in a minute.
The centre judge or
The centre referee, yeah. Yeah, we'll go through that. We'll go through that. When we've gone through the rules, we'll take questions. But that's a good question. But you're just one step ahead of us, all right? But all right. So that's the target areas, okay? The other thing, as I mentioned, is it's not just about the target area, it's also about the technique. So if I'm like this and I fall, and as a result of falling, my fist makes contact with Justin's torso, it's not a point, okay? Just because you made contact doesn't mean it's a point. It has to be executed correctly, which means with intent, what we say with rapidity. So it just can't be, you know, I just lift my leg. You see sometimes competitors just lift their legs like a zombie dance. They're not scoring points. If it's not a kick, it's not a point. If it's not a punch, it's not a point, okay? So it's not just a matter of falling with my hand out, okay? So it has to be deliberately executed, correct distance, and it has to be with rapid. So rapid means speed. So it has to be fast. It can't just be put an arm out, okay? So we want to score quality techniques. It's not every time the foot hits the target, it's a point. That's why sometimes when the score sheets come in, you have one judge scores 35 to 20 and the other judge scores 6 to 3, and they're both watching the same match. And you think, how is that possible? Because one person is scoring every time that the target gets touched, it's a point, and the other person might be scoring only a certain amount of contact scores a point, and the correct answer is, you know, quite often somewhere in between. As a judge, insist on quality techniques to score points, okay? The competitors don't generally know how many points they've scored, so don't feel obligated to score every time they throw a kick or every time they do a punch, okay? But if they execute it correctly and they reach the target correctly at the distance or the amount of contact that you've specified, then you're rewarded with a point or 2 points or 3 points. We'll go through that in a moment. All right, so that's important. So quality of techniques as well, okay? All right, so the scoring areas then. So I'll be the target. So between the hip and the body, if we say we have a kick that hits the torso, so we're here, kick, boom. Executed fast, good control, good distance, not swinging, not uncontrolled, okay? We say a midsection kick is 1 point, okay? All right, if it was a high kick, so here, boom, again, correct distance, correct appropriate level of contact and executed with balance and rapidity and all of those things, we score 2 points, okay? Hand technique to the body, okay, executed as a correct technique is 1 point. Hand technique to the face is 1 point, all right? Now, 1 point for the body, okay, 2 points for a foot technique to the face, 1 point for a hand technique to the face. Now, if we're airborne at the time, we say jumping, flying, whatever you want to call it, where there is no contact with the floor at the moment of contact with the target, okay, that's important, okay? That means that you kind of jumped and landed and then hit the target. Well, that wouldn't be classified as as a jumping technique when it comes to the actual score awarded. So if the person is in the air, kick, boom, clearly in the air, we add a point. So that becomes now 2 points instead of 1. Okay? If the person is in the air and they do the kick, boom, that becomes 3 points instead of 2. All right? The only exception will be a mid-air punch to the body. Okay? It's still 1 point. However, a mid-air hand technique to the face, okay, is 2. All right? So you got 1 point scoring techniques, 2 point scoring techniques, 3 point scoring techniques. But the most important thing is that the technique is executed correctly. Okay? Sparring is generally won, okay, or assuming the match goes the distance, sparring can only be won by the person who accumulates the most points. Okay. Now there are other reasons a match might stop. Okay, but let's just focus on this for the moment. The person who scores the most points wins. Okay, not dissimilar to basketball, not dissimilar to football. A lot of things can happen in the match, but the winner is the person who scores the most points. Okay, so there are some things, and Tony touched on. You know, we're talking about how to score. We're talking about where to score. Okay, there are some things that happen which are not scoring techniques, which are not aimed at the right parts of the body and so forth. Some of those are relatively minor. They're kind of incidental. They may or may not be deliberate. Okay, and then others are potentially a little bit more serious, maybe a little bit more deliberate in their intent. So we categorize these misdemeanors, if you like, into warnings. Warnings are those which are not putting the person at a great risk of injury, but they're not consistent with what is a scoring technique. And then you've got fouls, which are a little bit more risky in terms of the risk of injury to the other person, the level of intent of the person who's executing the technique, and to some degree, for some of the fouls, also the etiquette or respect shown towards your opponent or your official. But we'll start with warnings first. Okay, first of all, you'll notice we've done a little sort of mock ring area here, the red being the boundary. The ring size for sparring, the ITF rules say 7 by 7 of competitive area, and then with a buffer on the outside for safety. It used to be 9 by 9. 7 by 7, the rationale of bringing it in was more action, less people sort of running around the ring and just bouncing there, facing each other from 4 meters away. So you can have a smaller competitive area for sparring. You don't need to be able to build a house on a ring for sparring. Okay. However, sometimes if you're doing patterns, and we'll talk about patterns later on, but when you're doing patterns with 2 people in the ring at the same time, you'll find quite often, particularly with the higher belts, you'll find that ring area is sometimes a little bit small for patterns. Okay, but anyway, we're focusing on sparring at the moment. So we've got a boundary. The boundary should be clearly marked. Okay, now it also should be made clear to the competitors, particularly if you've only got one colour mat, where the boundary is and whether, so for example, if we've got the red, if we're on the red, are we still in the ring, or if we're on the red, we're out of the ring. So it has to be very clear whether the edge of the blue is the boundary or whether the edge of the red is the boundary. In this case, the way we've got it laid out, the blue would be the boundary, and when you're 1 foot in the red, you're still in. When you're both feet in the red, you're out. Okay. It's very clear when it's different colours for people to, with their peripheral vision, rather than looking at a little strip of sticky tape on the floor, knowing whether they're in or out of the ring. I like to put a coloured square in the middle, because that just makes it, when people are called into the centre of the ring, that we have a consistent starting point, usually that metre apart for us to start. And again, it looks good visually, but also gives us that clear start and finish point as well. Okay, so the ring area for sparring. If I leave the ring area, so we're talking about warnings, if I leave the ring area, so Justin does a technique, and as a result of the technique I go out, okay, I get a warning for leaving the ring, okay? Now, whether I left the ring deliberately or whether I left the ring because a technique was executed on me, I've still left the ring. The only exception would be if I'm forced out of the ring by a technique which is not according to the rules. Okay, so for example, other warnings would be pushing. So if I'm here and I'm pushed anywhere in the ring, it's a warning for pushing. If I'm pushed out of the ring, okay, it's a warning for pushing, but it's not also a warning for me leaving the ring because I was forced out of the ring by a technique which was not legal. So you can't have both people get a warning, okay? If one person did something which warrants a warning, which then affected the other person, the warning goes to the first person, okay? So if I was pushed, if I was held, if I was tripped, all of those things which caused me to fall, okay, so loss of balance if we're sparring, if something happens and I go down, well then I get a warning for loss of balance or for falling, okay? If his technique was legit. If his technique was illegal, so he kicks me in the leg, and I go down, he doesn't get a warning for the kick and I get a warning for falling. It can't be both. Because my fall was caused by what he did. If what he did was against the rules, he gets the warning, okay? If what he did was within the rules, I get the warning. Okay, so that's important. So we come to that question before, the person who deliberately avoids the contest. So avoiding the contest is a warning. So if Justin's punching and I just keep going like this and turning my back, okay, that's avoiding the contest. All right, so the question was, if the technique, so if he went to punch and I turned my back and he punched me in the back, and every time he went to punch, I turned my back and he punched me in the back, he doesn't score points, okay? I need to be getting warnings for turning them back, all right? It's not a point because it would have hit me in the front, but I turned my back, all right? And this is what I was trying to say earlier on. If it does not make contact with the front, if it does not make contact above the waist, it's never a point, okay? Now I know sometimes people use that as their strategy, turn their back to protect their target, okay? That's up to the center referee then to control it, because avoiding the contest, turning your back and so on, avoiding the contest is the rule, okay? Not turning your back, but sometimes we do it by turning our back. The reason we don't say turning your back is a warning, because if we say that, you can never do a reverse turning kick. You can never do a back kick, because to do those techniques, you have to turn your back. Okay, so the rule is not turning your back. The rule is avoiding the contest. Okay, so avoiding the contest as an example, but also avoiding the contest if I'm continually running away, and I'm never engaging in the contest, that's also avoiding the contest. I am allowed to move, but at some point I've got to come back, okay? If I'm just continually running around, that's also avoiding the contest, that's also a warning, all right? Sometimes you'll see both people just bounce, and they'll bounce, and they'll bounce, and they'll bounce, and nothing seems to happen. Referee should stop it, okay? That would be the only time, okay? I would give a verbal, prompt for them to engage, and if they continue to just bounce and bounce and bounce, that would be almost the only time I would give both people a warning, okay? Where they're both doing the same thing, okay? Which is again, avoiding the contest. There's no set amount of time that they're allowed to bounce for or not bounce for. That's purely your discretion, but you have to be consistent, okay? Because they have got the right to bounce if they want to bounce. They don't have to attack all the time. That's purely up to them, because if they're not attacking, they're also not scoring. So it's not to their advantage, all right? So that's important to understand. So as a referee, give warnings for the person who is deliberately presenting their back to the person without executing a technique. If I'm doing reverse turning kick and he kicked at the same time and it got me in the back, boom, okay, he doesn't get a point, okay, because it didn't hit the target area of the body. Sometimes those things happen. Sometimes we both spin at the same time, okay? But if, for example, he spun and I spun, and he kicked me in the leg, or I kicked him in the leg, that's still a low kick, regardless. It's not a low kick because we both spun. It's a low kick because it was low. I still get the warning, okay? That's important, because sometimes those things happen, you think, oh, what should I do there as a referee? Okay, so it needs to come back to, okay? Was the technique executed at a legal scoring part of the body? Was the technique, you know, if it was deliberate, if it was contact, it sort of gets more into the area of fouls. All right, but to score a point, to kick a goal, the ball has to go through the goals. Black and white, there's no grey area. If the ball doesn't go through the goals, it's not a goal. If the technique doesn't hit the scoring areas, it's not a point, okay? Doesn't matter the reasons why. Because the reasons why might be up to the referee to determine warnings and so on, okay? All right, other warnings. We mentioned pushing, holding, grabbing, those sort of things are all kind of similar. Leaving the ring, loss of balance. Those are your most common ones. Low kick, okay, where the kick doesn't reach the level of the hips, or the kick goes to the back. Sometimes a person, particularly with a turning kick, when they do off this leg and I'm facing this way, it's quite common for the kick to come to the back. If I'm turning this way and the kick hits the flank, okay, that is perfectly fine. If I'm this way, and sometimes we spar and we're sort of side facing, and he decides to kick there, that's a kick to the back. If I turn to take it, okay, then as a referee, you've got to determine whether the person turned as the kick was coming, or whether the person was already, if I'm already in this position, he's decided to kick where I am now. If I was in this position and the kick comes and then I do this, then the fault is mine, okay, not the person doing the kick. So again, I know it's not, it does require you to be very decisive and say, no, this is what I saw, this is what happened. Okay, the person didn't deliberately kick them to the back. Okay, the person was aiming for a legitimate target, but then the back was turned. However, what it never is, it's never a point. Okay, if it doesn't hit the scoring target, it's never a point. All right, and I know you might say, well, okay, that's a bit hard on the person. Well, you've got to find a way to hit the target. Okay, so I mean, we've got two legs. We can come from two directions. We've got two hands. We've got lots of options to score. Okay, but again, as a referee, you've got to make sure that you police or control the person who's deliberately taking the kicks on the body. Okay, not always the smartest thing to do, but I know some people sort of do that as a strategy to avoid giving away a point. Okay, they'll take it on the body, but you give them a warning for turning. If that kick was quite hard, okay, I turned, and sorry, if it was quite hard to the back, okay, I wouldn't give him a foul for contact because I contributed to it by presenting my back to allow him to kick it. However, if the kick was very, very hard, we have to decide if it had have hit the scoring target with the other leg just as hard, is it okay? Well, then our issue then is not the amount of contact. Our issue is only the target. So it's not really a contact issue. The same, and this is what we often see with umpiring, is if it hits a scoring area, they allow any amount of contact, but if it hits anywhere else, even the slightest amount of contact, they call it. So you've got to be really consistent when it comes to contact, okay? Contact very, very hard on the front of the body is excessive. If it was going to be excessive on the back, it would still be excessive on the front. And that's where there's a lot of inconsistency sometimes with umpiring. Okay, they allow hard kicks to the front, but then as soon as there's one that's semi-hard to the back, they give it a foul for contact. The issue is not the contact, the issue is the illegal target, okay? If the issue was the contact, it wouldn't matter whether it was front or back, okay? Then the issue is the amount of contact, right? That's important. And it's super important when it comes to the head, okay? Because as soon as there's contact to the head and the head rocks back, that's excessive contact, okay? But again, some people say, well, it's a scoring area, so therefore it's fine. It's not, Okay, once you dictate this is the amount of contact which is acceptable, anything beyond that is excessive, and it has to be excessive whether it's front or back, whether it scores or doesn't score. Okay, now we're going to get to fouls. So that's most of our most common warnings anyway. So I mentioned with excessive contact with fouls, so we don't actually even call it excessive contact, it's contact, but what we mean by that is contact beyond, you know, the realms of what we deem to be allowable. So excessive contact is just an easier way to understand it. The ITF rules don't say excessive contact, they just say contact, okay? But by the same token, where there's no contact, you can't score. So it's probably, you know, the problem is in the wording sometimes. So we're going to refer to it as excessive contact. So what we're saying is, if we have an allowable level of contact that we've determined was going to be acceptable for our bracket or our category, and the person goes beyond that. For me, it's not always just the amount of impact, it's also the intent and the control, okay? So you can hit someone with the same amount of impact, but with a good technique, bang, on the body, or you can just go bang and swing, and they're two different techniques. One has less control than the other. The difference will be, if Justin moved as I threw the technique, and I would, that's another way, sorry. Justin moved, we didn't rehearse that properly. If Justin moved out of the way as I threw my technique, and I lost balance, so I've got no control over the technique. The technique is controlling me. If Justin moved out of the way, and I missed as a result, but I'm still maintaining my balance, well, so it's a controlled technique. I didn't hit the target because he moved, or let's say he blocked. Okay, different scenario, I guess, but uncontrolled technique is where you don't, the technique controls your balance. The technique controls you. You're relying on momentum. You're relying on mass traveling rather than the actual execution of the tool, okay? And it tends to be more common in techniques that are swinging, okay? Because it's very difficult to swing and stop. I mean, you can do it, but it's more difficult. For a lot of people, they tend to swing and hopefully something stops it in between, usually the target, okay? And where the target doesn't stop, well then they keep going. Well, that would be, to me, uncontrolled technique. Now, as a referee, sometimes what will happen is the person, you can see they swing and it's clearly uncontrolled, it's clearly very, very hard, but the other person avoided it. And I see sometimes the official will stop them and give them a warning for excessive when no contact was made. It can't be excessive contact where no contact was made, okay? However, if my objective is to ensure the safety of the competitors, and what generally happens, especially with the beginners, I will take that opportunity to stop and I will say to the person, control your technique, okay? Because I don't want to wait. There are some umpires that wait for the injury first before they call the decision. If you wait for the injury first, especially with kids, especially with beginners, you're doing a disservice to the entire event. Okay, don't wait for the injury to happen and then say, okay, I'm going to penalize you for doing it, because this person's never coming back, or this person's going to be seriously hurt, or at least psychologically traumatized. Okay? What we do at the top level does not mirror what we do at the beginning grassroots level. Okay? I can't stress that enough. And I see that. I can't pay a foul because he didn't hit him. Okay, yes, but you can stop him and warn him. If you do that again, okay, I'm going to give you a foul. Okay? Because that is deliberate intent to cause injury. Okay? May not be the way we approach it at the elite level. We wait for it to happen first. But at the beginning level, we don't want to wait for it to happen first. Okay? Because it could happen first and that could be it. That could be the end of their taekwondo. And you know, so many people drop out because of an experience they have at a tournament. Okay? So it's very important. Are we doing this event to encourage people, or are we doing this event to lose people? Okay? Because the difference between encouraging them and losing them often lays in the way we officiate. All right? And almost always when it comes to sparring. Okay? Because sparring is the one event where you get hurt. potentially. Okay, so it's very important. We have to be super, super strict. So fouls, uncontrolled contact, excessive contact, deliberate contact to a non-scoring area. So if he's taken out my leg, you know, like Cobra Kai, and he's decided he's gonna leg chop me because, you know, he can, that's deliberate. Okay, deliberate regardless of the amount of contact. Okay, is deliberate. Excessive contact, if it wasn't deliberate, is still excessive contact. In both cases, they're fouls. So deliberate technique to a non-scoring area, excessive contact to any area of the body, they're both fouls. All right. If the opponent falls and the referee says break and he continues to attack, that's a foul. If the attack causes injury, that more than likely will be a disqualification if it's deemed as deliberate. We're not talking about someone who's got some momentum up and the person loses balance and they can't stop themselves. We're talking about someone who had the chance to stop and decided to keep going. Okay? And if there was enough time for the referee to stop, there's enough time for the competitor to stop. All right? So it would be at best a foul, at worst possibly a disqualification if it was, again, seen as being deliberate or causing injury. Okay. Disrespect to the opponent, disrespect to the official. If it's, you know, sometimes people curse in frustration. Okay. I'm here, something happens, and I say something, it doesn't really matter what I say, it's the way I say it, then that can be a foul. Okay. Okay, because again, we're talking about martial arts. It's not kickboxing, it's not MMA, it's not, you know, two bikies punching on outside the pub. This is martial arts, it should be etiquette. Okay, and part of the etiquette is self-control. We teach it, okay, and we expect people to show it. And one of those self-controls is the way we express ourselves when something doesn't go our way. It may be a point we didn't agree with, or frustration at our own inability to do something, or we got a warning that we didn't feel we should have got. We can never express, you know, I'm not saying you can't feel frustrated, but you shouldn't express that frustration in a way that can be deemed to be disrespectful to your opponent or to the official. And that would be, again, at best, a foul. If it's something, you know, minor, you know, if I sort of muttered something to myself, you know, then I might warn the person. Okay? If it's something, you know, where the person should have controlled it or said something completely inappropriate, then I would give a foul. If it's something threatening, if it's something where they, you know, tell you to go and do something which is not very pleasant to yourself, then I would stop the match. I would separate the opponents. I would go and consult with the jury president. And this has happened, I've done this at World Championships level. And I would say, look, this is what was said, and the person comes back in and they disqualify them immediately. Because there is a level of, you know, tolerance, but at some point the tolerance breaks. Okay? And it doesn't matter whether it was said in frustration or whether you intended to execute your threat. The fact is that you said it, and you said it to an official or you said it to an opponent. You know, so again, what we're trying to establish a culture. Okay, if we allow people to get away with that, then everybody who's watching sees that that is acceptable. And guess what happens later in the day, or guess what happens at the next competition? More and more people behave in that manner. Okay, and that's what you're trying to protect. Okay, we're trying to protect an environment, you know, which is safe and which is consistent with the ethos and the etiquette of Taekwondo in this case. All right, so disrespect to an official, disrespect for an opponent is a foul. If it's serious, if it's threatening, then more than likely would end up in a disqualification. However, center referee cannot disqualify somebody. Only the jury president can disqualify somebody. Okay? So that's important. That's why I say stop the match, separate the, don't leave them there, because if they're having a conflict, you turn your back, they might be punching on. You separate them, you send them back to their coach, or you sit them down facing the other way, and then you go and consult the jury president. So let's come back to the warnings and fouls in terms of how they impact the scoring then. Okay, Every time you accumulate 3 warnings, 1 point will come off the score. Okay? Now, often it's calculated at the end of the match. Okay? Or if you have electronic scoring or in real-time scoring, or you have the proper software, then it can be calculated in live time. You cannot be disqualified, however, for an accumulation of warnings. It doesn't have to be the same warning 3 times. It can be 1 warning for loss of balance, 1 warning for leaving the ring, 1 warning for avoiding the contest. Well, there's 3 warnings. I'm going to have a point taken off my final score. Okay, not 3 of the same thing. Okay, and there is no limit to how many warnings I can accumulate. It's not an advantage for me to accumulate lots and lots of warnings because it's coming off my score. Okay, all right. However, a foul is a point taken off immediately. Okay, 1 foul, 1 point. 2 fouls, 2 points. 3 fouls is disqualification. Again, sometimes people misinterpret. 3 points off is not a disqualification. Only 3 fouls is a disqualification. Some people think that 9 warnings means I lose 3 points, 9 warnings means I'm disqualified. That's incorrect. Okay? 3 fouls, it means you've done something serious 3 times. Not you've fallen over 9 times. Okay, you don't get disqualified for falling over. Okay, so it has to be 3 serious breaches, which is 3 fouls. Okay, but there is at any time in the match the person can be disqualified if it's seen as something beyond. Okay, what would normally be a foul. There's something which is serious, deliberate, and just not accepted in that environment. Okay. It could be something they say, something they do, okay? Or it might be that the person, and I guess this should be something which is controlled prior to the match even starting. If you suspect the person is under the influence of drugs, then you should have the person assessed by first aid before the match starts, okay? And, in all my time in Taekwondo, 35 years or whatever, I've actually seen it a couple of times, where the person clearly, I know some people always, look that way all the time, but the person clearly was affected by a substance and turned up to spar, okay? I've even seen where people were taking the substance in front of everybody in between rounds or every time they ran back to their coach. It was that blatant, That should never happen, obviously, and we're not a multi-million-dollar sporting organisation. We can't do drug testing on the morning of the match or the day before the match. We just have to rely. If we think there's something not right about the person, it's not just to protect the opponent, it's also to protect that person. Okay? First aid, assess them. Now, I know first aid is not necessarily a doctor, okay, but if first aid says, look, I don't think this person is fit to continue, then the match doesn't continue. Okay? So let's come to the other reasons a match can stop then. The match normally runs the full duration, and the person who scores the most points, once warnings and fouls are taken into consideration, is the winner all the time, okay? With the exception, sometimes a match can finish early. If a match finishes early, it's usually because the person is withdrawn, because they're not feeling well, or maybe, a legitimate technique hit them, but they're winded or they're a bit sore or they're hurt or whatever the case might be. The person voluntarily decides not to continue, or the coach decides, in many of the times with the case of juniors, the coach will decide that the person won't continue. Then that's what we call a forfeit. Okay, the person is withdrawn from the bout. The other person automatically is the winner, irrespective of the score. Doesn't matter what the score was at the time. If one person pulls out, the other person wins. Okay? However, if the match is stopped as a result of injury, there has to be a decision made over whether the injury was inadvertent, where it was just something that happened. For example, I tripped, rolled my ankle, I pulled my hamstring, or the technique was fair, but I got one in the guts and I'm a bit winded, or I'm a bit spooked, or a bit, I've got a bit of anxiety because I'm not used to being hit in the face, but there was nothing wrong with the technique, then the winner will be the person who didn't withdraw. But if the injury was caused by a technique which was not within the rules, so the contact was excessive, or the injury was to a target area which is not a legal target area, something wrong with the technique which resulted in injury, okay, then the result will go to the injured person. But here's the thing, very, very important as an umpire. If you know it was excessive contact, if you know it was an illegal technique, okay, every injury has to be attended to by first aid. Get the first aid to attend to the injury first. Don't call the foul first. Because if you call the foul first, the person knows, if I don't continue, I won. There is not a lot of incentive for that person to continue. However, if the person is attended to by first aid, and first aid says they can't continue, or if first aid says, I think they can continue, at that point, you will you've already decided, but at that point you will indicate whether it was a foul or whether it wasn't. You need to consult with the jury president at the time that you stop the match, call first aid, go to the jury president and say, I think that was a foul, okay? So the jury president knows. Don't wait to see the outcome of the first aid before you decide whether it was a foul or not. Okay, you need to make it very clear, and you need to share that with the jury president so that they know if the first aid says they can't continue, what the result is going to be, okay? Because again, otherwise that becomes part of the person's strategy. Stay down, don't get up, because we know it was excessive contact. As a referee, one of the other warnings we didn't mention is feigning injury or faking injury, pretending to be hurt. Now again, that's a really tricky one, because people have different pain tolerance. Some people get hit really, really hard and just smile and keep going. And some people just feel the wind of the fist going past their face and they take a dive like, a Premier League soccer player. All right. So you really got to be, as a referee, you've got to be very, very clear that the technique wasn't adequate to cause the amount of injury that they're indicating that they've got. To be clearer though, always call first aid, okay? Because you don't want to be wrong in case there is an injury, okay? Because again, duty of care, if the person is hurt and they're indicating they're hurt and you say, get up, I don't think you're hurt, keep going, and they actually are hurt, then, you've been a little bit negligent in that duty of care, all right? So when in doubt, call first aid. Okay? Now, if first aid decides the person shouldn't continue, then the person cannot continue. The person cannot go against the recommendation of first aid. All right? Sometimes first aid will say, no, look, I think, you should stop. And the coach will say, no, they'll be fine. Okay? It doesn't matter what the coach says. First aid decides whether the person continues or not. All right? If, as a referee, sometimes the temptation will be you go over and you say, oh, do you want to continue? Do you want to continue? As a referee, you don't say that. As a referee, you wait for first aid to make the decision. If first aid says then, I think the person is fine to continue, then you say to the person, do you wish to continue? They may say no. First aid doesn't feel that they're hurt enough to not continue, but the person may not want to continue. Yeah? They're feeling spooked, or they're feeling, they're just being, they're just over it. Okay, they don't want to continue. Or the coach might say, you know what, there's a chance they're going to get hurt again. I don't want to take that chance. I'm just going to withdraw them now. Okay, and then that's fine. The person withdraws. If they withdraw, the result goes to the other person. And sometimes that will happen, particularly in a mismatch, where there's a contact and the referee doesn't pull it up. Okay, and then it happens again and the referee doesn't pull up. Sometimes the coach will just withdraw the person because they don't have confidence that, you know, my competitor is not going to get hurt. As a coach, of course I want my person to win, but I don't want my person to get hurt as a result of poor officiating. I understand that, and my competitor should understand, and the family should understand that, particularly at a higher level, contact may be a consequence of the sport, but we do expect consistent and fair umpiring as well. All right? And we don't want to deliberately throw the person in there to get hurt. All right? But again, it's a fine line, because is it a legitimate injury? Is it more of a, you know, a psychological thing where I'm not winning and therefore, you know, I'm getting more and more frustrated? We got to distinguish between the both. As an umpire, I'm just there to police the rules as they pertain to that competition. I don't have a preference over who wins, but I don't want anybody to get hurt, okay, as a result of breaching the rules. Okay, so that's important. All right, anybody got questions about, so I think you can unmute yourself if you've got a question about sparring. Anyone? Because I've spoken long enough. We're going to go through some signals now. Questions about sparring? Anyone unclear about anything? You got one? I haven't got my glasses on, so